and welcome to the 2023 Kyiv Jewish Forum hosted by the Jewish Confederation of Ukraine and Tablet magazine. Our next panel explores the question of whether Ukraine is the Israel of Europe.
I'm Jeremy Stern, deputy editor of Tablet magazine. This panel is called Ukraine as the Israel of Europe, Lessons and Parallels. I'm very pleased to be here today with Bernard-Henri Lévy, philosopher, public intellectual, author, and filmmaker. He joins us from Paris. Josef Joffe, publisher, editor of the German weekly Die Zeit and distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And Simone Rodan-Benzaquen, managing director of AJC Europe. She also joins us from Paris. We've got about 40 minutes of discussion, so let's get started. First question, and we'll start with Dr. Joffe. So, in the United States, despite the ups and downs of its electoral politics, Israel has more or less managed to remain broadly bipartisan. Even in Europe, where popular support for Israel is perhaps a bit less robust, at the level of government-to-government relations, with the major European countries and Israel, relations remain very strong. Now, Ukraine, for all of last year, remained a broadly bipartisan issue in America and seemed like one of the few durable bipartisan issues in America. In early 2023, that remains the case, but we are hearing talk of Ukraine fatigue or Ukraine becoming a kind of political football on both sides of the aisle. So, Dr. Joffe, start us off. What do you see as the lessons or parallels in the Israeli experience for Ukraine?
Well, let's start with the U.S. and Ukraine. I don't think it's become a football yet. I don't think it will. What we have is some noise on one part of the Republican Party, which wants to spend less on Ukraine, and then something like that on the far left of the Democratic Party. And by the way, that reflects the opinion in Europe too. It's the far left and the far right, but not the huge, vast center that wants to cut aid or deny it completely to Ukraine. So I think for the time being, we are okay here. I will add this. I'm really quite amazed that the Europeans came together. That was not initially the case. With the French and the Germans trying to mediate. So for the time being, we are okay. We are in good shape. And I don't think it's going to last unless that war lasts forever. And that we don't know. We know how wars start. We don't know how they end.
Bernard, let's go to you. What parallels or lessons do you see in how Israel has managed to remain a more or less bipartisan issue in America? What can Ukraine learn from that experience?
What can Ukraine learn is, first of all, that it is crucial to be bipartisan. What I expect is that Ukraine will keep being a bipartisan cause. This is very important. If we want a real support for Ukraine, a real and efficient support, it should be by no way a football, as you said, case. I agree with what Josef just said, Mr. Joffe. I would just add it is not the few more additional points. It's not only a question of extreme left and extreme right, though it is that, of course. But those who are anti-Ukraine today in Europe, they sometimes belong to the mainstream, sometimes to the left and the right, because the question is the question of what we call in France sovereignism, which means the idea that the affairs of a nation should be solved inside the borders of a nation or of an area. You have some people in France, in Germany, in Spain, who really believe that it is a matter of Russia and Ukraine, that it is an inter-etatic war. As you know, Clausewitz made a distinction between inter-etatic wars and absolute wars. Ukraine, Russia, is an absolute war, and it is right to be involved, all of us. Some don't agree. They still believe that it is an interetatic war limited to a certain area of influence. Number two, you have on the right and on the left people who take seriously the theory of the linguistic nationalism. This theory, which was formulated a long time ago by an Hungarian linguist, historian, called István Bibó, which says where you speak French is France, where you speak German is Germany, when you speak Russian is Russia. This was also the theory of the worst of Europe and of the Nazism, of course, in the 30s. It is the theory of Putin. Putin and the people around him believe that where you speak Russian is Russia. You have some people who take seriously in France this idea on the left and on the right, not only extreme. And last point, you have another dividing line, which is very simple, which is cowardness and courage. You have people who keep repeating, and again, sometimes in the center, where why should we care about Donbass? As their grandfather said, why should we care about Danzig? You know, and those are just coward. They are just unable to catch the very essence, existential threat which concerns all of us. So all these dividing lines, added to the one which Mr. Joffe said, constitute in Europe a bipartisan camp of those who don't want to enter in this Ukrainian matter, and on the other side, the bipartisan coalition of those who know that the war which Zelensky is waging is our war.
Can I interrupt? Can I add something?
Sure, and then we'll go to Simone after you.
You know, the idea that Russia is where they speak Russian reminds me of Adolf Hitler, who said, you know, Germany is where Germans live. Germany is where Germans live. It's a recipe, prescription for imperialism.
That's exactly what I said. Yeah, Adolf Hitler was the one who took, alas, at the letter, this linguistic nationalism theory, of course, and that is one of the reasons why Putin is resuming the heritage of Hitler, of Nazism, and so on.
Simone, you're intimately familiar with the issue of Israel and the role it plays in European politics. What do you see as some of the ways that Ukraine might be able to replicate some of its successes or avoid some of its pitfalls?
So first of all, I agree both with Mr. Joffe and with Bernard-Henri Lévy about the fact that it's both a phenomenon you see on the far right and on the far left, but also within the center for different reasons, with different movements that are happening, whether it's isolationism, pacifism, or sovereignism. I'm slightly less optimistic, even though I stay optimistic, that things are, that support is deteriorating, particularly in the United States, because Ukraine is far away, because the situation on the ground, the economic situation is complicated, and yes, because also of polarization. When you look at the last few research, you can clearly see that both on the Republican side and on the Democratic side, there is a decrease of support. When you compare the numbers, I think in the fall, the Republican support was about 30%. Those who think that there was too much support for Ukraine was about 30%. Now it's 40%. The same goes for the Democratic Party. It went from 5% to 15%. So I think, that unfortunately, we do see a movement And I do think, going back to what Mr. Joffe said, that it has to do also with the fact of the fringes of both parties, meaning that there is something going on the right of the Republican Party and on the left of the Democratic Party for two different reasons. One is more sort of linked to isolationism, the other more linked to what it can call maybe pacifism. But I think it is a dangerous movement, and it brings me, therefore, also back to Israel, because you're right, Israel has had bipartisan support for a very long time, but with the polarization going on in both parties and fringes that we see in both parties, you do see also the same phenomenon taking place. It's minimal, it's marginal, it's not representative at all, but it is there, and I think it joins to some extent the same dynamics, the same forces that are happening with relations to the support of Ukraine.
Okay, thanks very much. Let's get into a question about history and national identity. So in one sense, the contemporary state of Israel is the continuation of a story that's been going on for millennia, and that's the story of the Jewish people. And in another sense, the current state of Israel is something entirely new and completely distinct in world history and in Jewish history. And that's in part based on an identity that's been formed through the wars for survival that Israel has had to fight over the last 80 years. Where do you see Ukraine in these terms? Is contemporary Ukraine part of a story that goes back hundreds of years, at least to Catherine the Great, about territorial struggle with its larger neighbor? Or is something new being forged here? Can we talk about a kind of break in Ukrainian history in the last year? Josef, let's start with you.
I don't think it's a break. We often think that Ukraine is something like Russia, and the idea is from the Kievan Rus, which, by the way, was not a Russian construction but a Norseman construction. So for hundreds of years, they've been fighting for autonomy and independence. So it is not something which occurred on the 24th of February last year. We forget that Ukraine really is a nation with a distinct and very old identity. If you want to compare it to Israel, well, Jews have had 2,000 years of identity, or 3,000. It's not quite as long in the Ukrainian case, but we're talking about almost for a millennium of very separate and intensive identity. And that's why the Russians, by the way, since Stalin and Lenin, have been trying to destroy that identity. They have banned books, they have banned theater, they have arrested directors, they have closed libraries. If there were no identity, the Soviets and the Russians wouldn't have done it.
Bernard, let's go to you.
Two things about the Kyiv of Rus, which Josef just mentioned. It's an incredible case of historical revisionism. As you know, the Putin propaganda says that the Kyiv of Rus, the Rus of Kyiv, is the proof that Ukraine belongs to Russia, which is absolutely stupid. It's exactly the reverse. Ukraine was really the stemming point. It was the source. It was the departure point of Russia itself. Ukraine existed, the Rus of Kyiv existed much before that any sort of state or political entity existed in Moscow or in Petersburg. And clearly, Ukrainian nation is more ancient than the Russian one, which is generally told on the reverse, number one. Right. Number two, about Israel and Ukraine, I like the title you gave to our discussion. I liked it because there are a lot of similarities. Number one, both Israel and Ukraine have been built by poets, by have been continued. The flame has been constantly burning because of writers, poets, mythologists, and so on. For Israel, it's very well known. For Ukraine, a little less well known, but it is true. I could elaborate on that. Second point, you are right, is the phenomenon of the war. In Israel, it is clear that there was a breaking point in 1948 with the first war against Israel launched by the neighbors, and this created a very strong contributor to create, even in a stronger way, a national identity. Same for Ukraine. You had, before 2014, one could say that you had two different Ukraine, one speaking Ukrainian, one speaking Russian, the East and the West, maybe the South also, the Odessa region, and so on and so on. I know Ukraine since long. I never saw Ukraine so united, so much feeling as a nation, than since the beginning of this war, which is 2014, and even more with the invasion on the 24th of February 2022. So there is a 1948 moment for Ukraine today, 1948 like in Israel, which is, under the pressure of the war, a strong national consciousness taking place. And the third point, which make the two the national experience of Israel, national experience of Ukraine look like, is that they are very special nations. And what is special in both of them, I would say, is the internationalist dimension of the two nations. Israel, as you know, was, as we all know, was the miracle of a nation made by people coming from the East, from the West, from Africa, from Arab world, from Russia, and so on. And all of a sudden, like in a sort of Jean-Jacques Rousseau social contract, building a nation. Ukraine, you have some Tatar, you have some Cossack, you have some very various and different ethnicities, speaking a lot of languages, and all that makes a sort of melting pot, building a nation. And this sense of a strong nation coming out, stemming out multi-ethnicity, multi-language, and multi-identity, and making a strong nation, under a strong commander-in-chief and so on, this is not so frequent, and this again is a bridge between the experience of Israel and the experience of Ukraine.
Simone, let's get your thoughts.
I frankly don't have so much to add. Bernard basically said exactly what I want to say. But I think, indeed, the second point which he mentioned, the fact that the Maidan revolution really profoundly changed the sense of national identity, and the parallels between 1948 and, I would say, indeed, the 2014 is pretty striking. Let's just hope that it will have exactly the same outcome.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's close with a question about geopolitics. So, Israel is a country that in many ways punches above its weight in military terms, in diplomatic terms, in economic and technological terms. And some say that this is actually the result of certain dynamics that are ordinarily considered weaknesses of Israel, namely its small size and its geography, being surrounded by countries that historically have not been interested in the future of Israel's survival. And the theory there is that when your margin for survival is razor thin, it forces you to have excellent political intelligence, it forces talent to the top, it gives you a very low tolerance for bad ideas or incompetent people. And maybe there's a certain way that this can explain how a small, inexperienced country was able to become so militarily formidable in such a short amount of time. In Ukraine, we've seen in the last year, seemingly almost overnight, was able to build the most formidable land army in Europe. What does the experience of Israel in this sense make you think about the future military and economic potential of Ukraine, that its geography is not changing anytime soon, as this is going to force it to have to probably continually fight for its survival? Simone, let's start with you and then we'll go down the line.
Sure. So very quickly, I would say, first of all, there is obviously a lesson for Ukraine, and there are indeed parallels between of this small nation to be extremely vigilant, have no patience for mistakes, actually take threats seriously. But I think there is also a lesson for the world in particular, because most of the world didn't believe that this would happen, didn't listen to what Vladimir Putin said repeatedly, what Vladimir Putin did repeatedly. And I think so there's a very important lesson as well for the world, and a message that Ukraine can convey to the world. Actually take the words of autocrats like Putin seriously. Don't believe that we live in a world where everything, where everything goes by wishful thinking, but take threats seriously. The other, I think, important aspect is that Ukraine, just like Israel, has been fighting and is fighting both for liberty and for democratic values. There, I think there is a very important lesson to be learned. There are obviously a lot of debates right now where Israel is going and whether Israel's democracy will survive. The reality is that over the past decade, despite this environment in which Israel lives, despite of the permanent state of war Israel is in, it has created and maintained an incredibly strong democracy and an incredibly strong sense of self and fighting for liberty. So as a lesson for Ukraine, and I think some of the steps that have been taken, including about corruption, for example, in the past weeks, including about the fact that, of course, Ukraine has made it very, very clear that it wants to be part of the European Union and of the West, and therefore be part of the idea of the Western world and democratic values, is clearly a parallel and I think a hopeful path to the future.
Josef, let's go to you.
I think if you are Israel or Ukraine, you have to be on your toes 24/7, or you end up in a wheelchair or in a coffin. I think that certainly concentrates the mind. Next point, the army is at the core of all of this. Why? First of all, just by sheer necessity and experience, it's the best trained army in the world, which has been fighting since day one. There's no other army which can match the Israeli in terms of experience and capacity. And finally, we talked about this, about talent rising to the top. If you are in that kind of position, that's what you have to do. And the interesting thing is that Israel has a draft army. So every year, as the cohort of 18-year-olds comes online, the army has perfect knowledge of their intelligence, their biometrics, their skills, and it allows them to match talent with position. One example to me is Unit 8200, which is in cyber warfare and digital technology. I think Unit 8200 is like MIT and Stanford rolled into one. And with an endless supply of highly talented people, I think the Ukraine is doing and has to do the same thing, which is to bring the best and the brightest into the armed forces, because the threat, no matter how that war ends, is not going to subside. And that's, to me, the parallel between the two countries.
Bernard, let's get your thoughts.
I agree with most of what was said. 1948, 2014, that's true, same sort of miracle. 2014 in Ukraine, the army was so weak. Remember when it was the army was beaten in Crimea without fighting, and it took a few years to build the strongest army in Europe. The strongest because not only weaponry and technicity, but bravery and will to use. Israel, of course, there was the Haganah before, a real tradition of fighting, but it took so little time also in 1948 to build a real brave army. So there is a very evident parallel. Is it due to the existential threat, you ask? Probably yes, but not completely. I know some countries, including mine, France, who were under existential threat, but who did not fight and who even submitted. I'm thinking of 1940. We had in France, my generation of my fathers had an existential threat above their heads. Some of them, like my father, did fight and did resist, but a lot of them collapsed. And you can have a country under military existential threat that chooses to collapse, to commit suicide, and to die. So there is not an absolute correlation between the threat and the bravery. If you don't have bravery in your mental DNA, in your history, and so on, you cannot improvise it. And last thing, which I would say, is that what in the two cases, Israel and Ukraine, what makes the two armies probably invincible? I really believe that Tzahal is at this moment invincible, impossible to win against it. And same about Ukraine. I think they will win the war. They have to win, and they win, and they will win. And I know I spent a month and month on the front lines documenting the Ukrainian army. I know that by experience. They will win. Why? Because like Israel, they defend two things. They defend their fatherland, and they defend at the same time a sky of values. In Israel, it is the case. Tzahal defends, of course, a ground and earth, but defends also a conception of the world, the summit of the history of a book and Judaism. In Ukraine, it is the same. All the soldiers I met in Kharkiv, in Kherson, in Izium, all over the front, said always two things, really. Number one, we are fighting because we defend our families. Number two, we are fighting because we defend a certain idea of Europe, which means of democracy, of self-government, of a state of law, and so on and so on. And when you have this, the foot on the earth and the head in the sky, which is the case of Israel and the case of Ukraine, really, you can put all the meat waves that you want in front, like Russia do today. Meat waves, you can put all of that. You can shell as much as you want. Of course, there will be some huge casualties, but you will win. Those who defend at the same time their land and a sky of value, they cannot be defeated. That's really what I think. And we know that's in the ancient Greeks, the speech of Pericles in the War of Peloponnese in Thucydides said exactly that. And we are experiencing it today in Israel and in Ukraine.
Well, you're three of the great experts on European politics, and I can't let you go today without asking the all-important question that a lot of people are wondering about, which is the possibility of Ukrainian accession to the European Union and to NATO. Let's get each of your thoughts. What will it take? What are the big obstacles, and what are your predictions for this happening in the future? Josef.
Let me preface this with something that goes back to the beginning of our conversation. What about the rest of Europe? How come they've come around after lots of hesitation? I think the Europeans, right or left, pacifists or not, bellicist, understand that Ukraine is fighting for them too. They are fighting for the balance of Europe. They are fighting against Russian imperialism. They're fighting to restore an order in Europe, which for 77 years has maintained great power peace. So that's why I would think this is the support is going to last for a while. As to the EU, if I look at the rhetoric of governments, there is a general willingness to let them in. With the usual provisos, you have to fight corruption and all that. But I'm quite amazed that the Europeans tried for so long to stay on Russia's good side are now understanding the big time issue. And while Ukraine, of course, is not going to be admitted to NATO, I think the EU is on the books. The problem with EU membership is it takes a hell of a lot of time before they actually sign the dotted line. But in principle, I'll conclude, yes, it's going to happen. Don't ask me when.
Simone, let's go to you.
Same answer. It's going to happen. I don't know when as well. But as Josef said, I think conceptually and spiritually something has happened, not just in Europe, but I think more generally for liberal democracies. And it's no coincidence. I think I'm part of a generation of people who, contrary to my parents and to my grandparents, who had lived both through Nazism and communism, had sort of gotten used to the idea that, democracy, liberal democracy, were there. And I think people had gotten lazy and had started to go through a process of both internally taking liberal democracies apart and letting the European continent be taken apart from foreign actors, whether it's Russia, China, Iran, Qatar, or others, who basically were taking advantage of our weakness. And I think there is generally a clear understanding, whether it's said or implicit or somehow felt, that we have come to a point where we actually have to fight for who we are, what we care about, and what is intrinsically us. So this is, I think, the reason why Ukraine will be part of the European Union, because it is intrinsically linked not only to our future and to the continent itself, but to the very idea of who we are.
Bernard, as you know, there are some well-known intellectuals in the United States who, for the last year, have been arguing that the threat of Ukrainian accession to NATO and to the European Union is part of what justified the war as far as the Russians were concerned in the first place. Now it seems like no one takes those arguments very seriously anymore, and that accession to EU and NATO is part of the end game of this war that the United States and Europe should be interested in. What do you make of that? What would you say?
Yes, what I make of it is that we are discovering how wrong, how stupid were these arguments. We decided not to let Ukraine into EU. We decided to rebuff Ukraine from NATO, and the invasion happened. And we can never, I do think that it is because we did not let Ukraine in NATO, that the worst happened, that we are facing this total war at the heart of Europe, that we are facing this escalation, and so on. So the wise solution would have been, since the beginning, since a long time, to start the process of admission of Ukraine in EU and in NATO. As for myself, I remember having written in the French newspaper Le Monde an article in 2008. I did ask that for Georgia, Tbilisi, and for Ukraine. I said with my pal, with my friend, past now, André Glucksmann, we co-signed an op-ed to say that the wisdom was to accept them into EU and into NATO. We were not wise, we, the Westerners, and we pay the price today, and Ukraine pays the highest price. About NATO, things have accelerated a lot. Today, when I compare the situation to what it was in 2008, Ukraine is part of NATO, de facto. Ukraine is in NATO. Not because NATO nations protect Ukraine, Article 5, but because Ukraine protects the West. So, and protect the West behaves as the border of the West and of Europe with our weapons. Ukraine is the place where German weapons, French weapons, American weapons are used in order to protect what has to be called the free world against an imperialist attack from Putin. So what is NATO if not that? So NATO is a de facto thing. About EU, I would just add one point. Nothing new really happened, except that the Ukrainians say the same thing since 10 years. In 2014 on the Maidan, they already said, we are Europeans. They already said, we want to embrace the European constitution. They already died with the European flag in their arms. The only difference between this time and today is that at this time we did not listen. We did not listen. Today, at last, finally, but so late, and after so many deaths, we decided to listen. So Ukrainians did not change. They say the same since 10 years. We change, we pay attention, and now we have to speed. We have to accelerate, and we have to recatch the lost time.
Okay, well, on behalf of the Kyiv Jewish Forum, I want to thank Bernard-Henri Lévy, Josef Joffe, Simone Rodan-Benzaquen. It's been a pleasure speaking with all three of you. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and we'll see you all again soon.